When the spectators at Constantinople's spectacular circuses split into factions, it threatened to bring the Eastern Empire down. The day was saved by Byzantine's remarkable empress, but only at the cost of 30,000 lives. Bread and circuses, the poet Juvenal wrote scathingly, that's all the common people want. Food and entertainment, or put it another way, basic sustenance and bloodshed, because the most popular entertainments offered by the circuses of Rome were the gladiators and chariot racing, the latter often as deadly as the former. As many as 12 four-horse teams raced one another 7 times around the confines of the greatest arenas. The Circus Maximus in Rome was 2,000 feet long, but its track was no more than 150 feet wide, and rules were few, collisions all but inevitable, and hideous injuries to the charioteers extremely commonplace. Ancient inscriptions frequently record the deaths of famous racers in the early 20s, crushed against the stone spina that ran down the center of the racetrack, or dragged behind their horses after the chariots were smashed. Charioteers, who generally started out as slaves, took these risks because there were fortunes to be won. Successful racers who survived could grow enormously wealthy. Another poet, Martial, grumbled in the 1st century AD that it was possible to make as much as 15 bags of gold for winning a single race. Diocles, the most successful charioteer of them all, earned an estimated 36 million sesterces in the course of his glittering career, a sum sufficient to feed the whole city of Rome for a year. Spectators, too, wagered and won substantial sums, enough for the races to be plagued by all manner of dirty tricks. There is evidence that the fans sometimes hurled nail-studded curse tablets onto the track in an attempt to disable their rivals. In the days of the Roman Republic, the races featured 4 color-themed teams: the Reds, the Whites, the Greens, and the Blues, each of which attracted fanatical support. By the 6th century AD, after the western half of the empire fell, only 2 of these survived. The Greens had incorporated the Reds, and the Whites had been absorbed into the Blues. But the 2 remaining teams were wildly popular in the Eastern or Byzantine Empire, which had its capital at Constantinople, and their supporters were as passionate as ever, so much so that they were frequently responsible for bloody riots. Exactly what the Blues and the Greens stood for remains a matter of dispute among historians. For a long time it was thought the 2 groups gradually evolved into what were essentially early political parties. The Blues representing the ruling classes and standing for religious orthodoxy, and the Greens being the party of the people. However, the games were more important than politics in this period, and perfectly capable of rousing violent passions on their own. In 501, for example, the Greens ambushed the Blues in Constantinople's amphitheater and massacred 3,000 of them. 4 years later, there was a riot caused by the triumph of Porphyrius, a Green charioteer who had defected from the Blues. This suggests that after about 500, the rivalry between the Greens and the Blues escalated and spread well outside Constantinople's chariot racing track, the Hippodrome, a slightly smaller version of the Circus Maximus, whose central importance to the capital was illustrated by its position directly adjacent to the main imperial palace. Byzantine emperors had their own entrance to the arena, a passageway that led directly from the palace to their private box. This friction came to a head during the reign of Justinian, one of Byzantine's greatest but most controversial emperors. In the course of Justinian's reign, the empire recovered a great deal of lost territory, much of North Africa and the whole of Italy, but it did so at enormous cost, and only because the emperor was served by some of the most able of Byzantine heroes, the great General Belisarius, who has good claim to be ranked alongside Alexander, Napoleon, and Lee, an aged but vastly general named Narses, who continued to lead armies into the field into his 90s, and perhaps the most important of all, John of Cappadocia, the greatest tax administrator of his day. John's chief duty was to raise the money needed to fund Justinian's wars, and his ability to do so made him easily the most hated man in the empire, not least among the blues and the greens. Justinian had a fourth advisor, though, one whose influence over him was even more scandalous than the Cappadocians. This was his wife Theodora, who refused to play the subordinate role normally expected of a Byzantine empress. Theodora, who was exceptionally beautiful and unusually intelligent, took an active role in the management of the empire. This was a controversial enough move, but it was rendered vastly more so by the empress's lowly origins. Theodora had grown up among the working classes of Byzantium. She was a child of the circus who became Constantinople's best-known actress. Her mother was probably an acrobat. She was certainly married to the man who held the position of bear-keeper to the Greens. When he died unexpectedly, leaving her with 3 young daughters, the mother was left destitute. Desperate, she hastily remarried and went with her infant children to the arena, where she begged the Greens to find a job for her new husband. They pointedly ignored her, but the Blues, sensing the opportunity to paint themselves as more magnanimous, found work for him. Unsurprisingly, Theodora thereafter grew up to be a violent partisan of the Blues, and her unswerving support for that faction became a factor in Byzantine life after 527, when she was crowned as empress. Not least because Justinian himself, before he became emperor, had given 30 years of loud support to that same blue team. These two threads, the fast-growing importance of the circus factions and the ever-increasing burden of taxation, combined in 532. By this time, the government had introduced no fewer than 26 new taxes, many of which fell for the first time on Byzantine's wealthiest citizens. Their discontent sent shockwaves through the imperial city, which were only magnified when Justinian reacted harshly to an outbreak of fighting between the Greens and the Blues at the races of January 10th. Sensing the disorder had the potential to spread, and eschewing his allegiance to the Blues, the emperor sent in his troops. 7 of the ringleaders in the rioting were condemned to death. The men were taken out of the city a few days later to be hanged, but their executions were botched. 2 of the 7 survived when the scaffold broke. The mob that had assembled to watch the hangings cut them down and hustled them off to the security of a nearby church. The 2 men were, as it happened, a blue and a green, and thus the 2 factions found themselves for once united in a common cause. The next time the chariots raced in the hippodrome, the crowd's loud chanting took on a hostile edge. The Greens vented their resentment at the imperial couple's support for their rivals, and the Blues their anger at Justinian's sudden withdrawal of favor. Together, the 2 factions shouted the words of encouragement they generally reserved for the charioteers. Nika! Nika! Win! Win! It became obvious that the victory they anticipated was of the factions over the emperor, and with the races hastily abandoned, the mob poured out into the city and began to burn it down. For 5 days, the rioting continued. The Nika riots were the most widespread and serious disturbances ever to occur in Constantinople. On the 4th day, the Greens and the Blues sought out a possible replacement for the emperor. It was at this point that Theodora proved her mettle. Justinian panicked, was all for fleeing the capital to seek the support of loyal army units. His empress refused to countenance so cowardly an act. "If you, my lord," she told him, "wish to save your skin, you will have no difficulty in doing so. We are rich. There is the sea. There, too, are our ships. But consider first whether, when you reach safety, you will regret that you did not choose death in preference. As for me, I stand by the ancient saying, the purple is the noblest winding sheet." Shamed, Justinian determined to fight. Belisarius planned a counterstrike. The blues and the greens, still assembled in the hippodrome, were to be locked in the arena. After that, loyal troops would be sent in to cut them down. The exits were blocked, and Belisarius' soldiers hacked away at the rioters. The hippodrome was a stadium with a capacity of about 150,000. Within a few minutes, John Julius Norwich writes in his History of Byzantium, the angry shouts of the great amphitheater had given place to the cries and groans of wounded and dying men. Soon these too grew quiet, until silence spread over the entire arena, its sand now sodden with blood of the victims. With the massacre complete, Justinian and Theodora had little trouble re-establishing control over their smoldering capital.